My name is Henry. I work as an antiques dealer. It's not a very exciting profession most of the time, but every now and then, something comes along that changes everything. I thought my life would just keep on the same track. Old documents, paintings, ancient coins, that sort of thing. Until the day I was offered a journal. A very old journal, handwritten, in archaic Portuguese. I was in my office, downtown. I had just arrived, hadn't even had my coffee yet. The doorbell rang and in walked an old man, all sweaty, holding a brown backpack. He told me, "Mister, I found this inside an old wall, in a house we were demolishing." I took the journal and felt a shiver. The cover was leather, somewhat cracked. It had a strange symbol, like a cross mixed with a sun. I opened the first page and there was the name, Journal of Bento de Almeida, 1822. I had never heard of the guy, but something told me he was important. The man asked for 2,000 reis for the journal. I didn't even think. I paid him on the spot. I spent the rest of the day reading it. The Portuguese was archaic, but you could understand it. This Bento de Almeida claimed to have been part of a Portuguese expedition that went deep into the Amazon. He wrote of isolated tribes, giant rivers, animals I didn't even know existed. But what hooked me the most was when he wrote about a place he called the Forbidden Valley. Bento said the Forbidden Valley held a treasure, but he wasn't talking about gold or precious stones. He said that there were things made by man, but too dangerous to exist. I confess, at that point, I thought it was just some explorer's crazy talk. But as I kept reading, I saw hand-drawn maps, detailed routes, even references to geographical points that actually existed. I spent the whole night reading it. I couldn't put it down. It felt like Bento was speaking to me from beyond the grave, asking me to continue his work. At the end of the journal, there was a sentence that stuck in my head. If it falls into the wrong hands, the Forbidden Valley could destroy nations. The next day, I woke up decided. I called a friend of mine, Caesar, who used to work as a guide in the Amazon. I told him the basics, without going into too much detail. He laughed, thought I was crazy. "Henry, are you trying to go on a treasure hunt?" I said it wasn't exactly a treasure, that it could be something much bigger. Caesar replied that the Amazon swallows people whole, but even so, he agreed to help me. I started to organize everything. Vaccinations, documents, authorization to enter restricted areas. I spent almost everything I had in my bank account, but my mind was only on one thing, finding out what Bento had seen. My family thought I had lost my mind. My sister called me, said I was wasting my life chasing the legend of some dead old man, but I couldn't stop. Something in that journal was pulling me, like a magnet. Finally, about 2 weeks later, I took a plane to Manaus. I arrived to a heat that felt like it could burn your lungs. Caesar was waiting for me at the airport, with his beat-up hat and a slightly suspicious smile. "Henry, are you sure about this? Because once you go in, there's no pause button in the jungle." I said I was sure, but inside my stomach was in knots. We spent 2 days in Manaus buying equipment, tents, repellent, GPS, freeze-dried food. I didn't even know what half of that stuff was for. On the last night before we left, we were having dinner at a simple restaurant when Caesar got serious and said, "The place you want to go, the locals call it the Forbidden Valley for a reason. They say whoever goes in either doesn't come back, or comes back different." I asked him what he meant by different. He just replied, "People who forget who they are, who start to fear their own name." I gave a nervous laugh, told him it was all superstition. But deep down, something told me it wasn't just that. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the hotel room, watching the fan spin, thinking about what was waiting for me in there. The next day, I woke up before sunrise. I put my backpack on and went to meet Caesar in the lobby. He looked at me seriously, handed me a machete and said, "Last chance to back out, Henry." I took the machete, put it on my belt and replied, "Let's go to the Forbidden Valley." We left Manaus before the sun came up. The car shook so much on the road it felt like it was going to fall apart. I held onto the door handle, looking out the window at the endless green expanse that seemed to have no end. Caesar drove in silence, just fiddling with the radio now and then, but couldn't find a station. The air inside was so humid I could feel my clothes sticking to my body. With every kilometer that passed, I wondered if I shouldn't have just stayed home. But then I'd remember Bento's journal and feel like I had to see it through. After about 6 hours on the road, we stopped in a small village, the kind that doesn't even show up on a map. There were a few wooden houses, people sitting on the roadside selling fruit, and some skinny dogs wandering around. Caesar said this was where we'd get a boat. When I got out of the car, it felt like the heat had tripled. Sweat was running down my back, plastering my shirt to my body. Caesar went to talk to some boatmen while I held the backpacks. I looked around and felt the locals' eyes on me as if I were an alien. I guess they knew I wasn't from around there. One of the men, very old, came up to me and asked what I was going to do on the river. I told him I was looking for some old ruins. He shook his head and told me to be careful. "The Forbidden Valley doesn't like strangers," he said. I laughed at the time, but I confess a chill ran up my spine. We got into a boat that looked like it was about to sink. It was narrow, made of dark wood, with an engine that coughed more than it ran. Caesar stood at the front, talking to the pilot, while I tried to keep my balance so I wouldn't fall into the water. The river was wide, brown, seemingly endless. Around every bend, a green wall so high it seemed to be hiding something. The sound of the forest was hard to explain. It wasn't just birds singing. There were noises that sounded like whispers, as if someone was always watching us. The wind was hot, carrying the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. I felt smaller and smaller in that place. After about 3 hours on the boat, Caesar pointed to a bend in the river and said that's where the trail to the Forbidden Valley began. The boat's pilot stared with wide eyes and said he wouldn't go any further. He said that whoever goes past that point never comes back. Caesar tried to offer him money, but the man stood firm. I saw the fear in his face, and it gave me a tight feeling in my chest. We got off the boat on a kind of embankment. The mud was so soft I almost lost a boot. The boatman turned his boat around and left quickly as if the place were cursed. We stood there, me and Caesar, just listening to the forest. Caesar took a deep breath and said, "Henry, if we go in, there's no easy way back. Either we find what you're looking for, or we'll have to fight to get out alive." I nodded, trying to look confident, but inside, all I could think was that I might be completely insane. We started walking. Every step seemed harder than the last. The ground was damp, slippery. There were vines everywhere, giant leaves slapping against my face. The sound of the animals seemed to get louder the deeper we went. Sometimes I'd hear strange noises like loud snaps, as if someone was breaking branches very close by. I asked Caesar if it was an animal or a person. He just replied, "Out here it could be anything." After walking for almost 2 hours, we reached a more open place, a clearing in the middle of the woods. The sun beat down hard there. There were huge moss-covered rocks with water trickling down them. Caesar stopped and said we would rest a bit. I sat on a rock, took off my backpack, and drank some water while I looked around. The place was beautiful, but there was something wrong in the air, a feeling that I was being watched. Caesar looked at me and said, "Henry, if you're having any doubts, now is the time to give up." I looked him in the eye and said, "I've come this far. I'm not going back without knowing what Bento wanted to show me." We kept walking, and with every step, I felt like I was entering a place where no human should ever set foot. The forest grew thicker after we left that clearing. The air seemed to get heavier, more humid, hard to breathe. The sunlight barely made it through the leaves anymore. It was like the jungle was a green ceiling above our heads. I could hear every drop of water dripping on the leaves, every snap of a twig as if it were someone stepping behind us. Sometimes I would stop to listen, thinking someone was following us. Caesar told me not to be nervous, but he himself kept looking over his shoulder. We walked for a few more hours until we reached a narrow river with black water, so dark it looked like oil. Caesar said we had to cross. I asked if there were snakes, caimans, that sort of thing. He looked at me seriously and said there was all that and then some, but there was no other way. So we took off our boots, secured our backpacks high on our backs, and stepped into the water. The current was slow, but the water came almost up to my chest. Every time something brushed against my leg, I thought I was going to be pulled under. On the other side, the bank was high, covered in roots. Caesar pulled me and helped me climb up. When we got to the top, I was shaking all over, soaked to the bone. We kept walking, and at a certain point, I started to notice some strange things. Huge trees had symbols carved into their trunks. It looked like indigenous writing, but it also resembled old letters, like the ones in Bento's journal. I asked Caesar what it meant. He said he had no idea, but that we should be respectful, that it wasn't good to touch anything. Even so, I kept taking pictures of everything with my cell phone. Who knew when I'd need to prove to someone that this was all real? Further on, we found what looked like a stone wall in the middle of the woods. It was giant, covered in moss and roots. It had marks of something like inscriptions, but so worn by time, you could barely see them. Caesar ran his hand over the stone, as if trying to feel something. He said softly, "If there's an entrance here, It's very well hidden. I started knocking on the stone, trying to find a hollow sound, like in the movies. But it all seemed solid. Caesar told us to keep walking, that maybe there was another entrance ahead. We continued on the trail, but I began to notice that Caesar was restless. He was looking around all the time, holding his machete tighter. I asked him what was going on. He said he smelled smoke. I said I didn't smell anything, but he swore he did. And if there was fire, there were people. And according to him, people in that part of the jungle were never a good sign. A short time later, we found footprints in the dirt. They looked relatively recent. Caesar crouched down, touched the ground, and said they weren't ours. I asked if it was an animal or a person. He said it was a person, and that if it was people, it could be traffickers, illegal miners, or worse, someone who wanted to protect the Forbidden Valley from intruders like us. Then, I confess, I started to get really scared, because until then, it had all seemed like an adventure. But at that moment, I realized I was in bigger trouble than I could imagine. Caesar said that from then on, we'd better walk in silence, and quickly. The problem is that walking quickly in the forest is almost impossible. Every few feet there was a vine, a hole, mud. Even so, we tried. The forest seemed to get darker, more suffocating. The air was so still it felt like it wouldn't enter my lungs. I could feel the sweat dripping from my face like rain. Suddenly we heard a loud noise as if something had fallen nearby. Caesar pushed me behind a tree and told me to be quiet. We stayed there, not breathing, listening to heavy footsteps in the woods. It was someone. We couldn't see who, but you could feel they were close. The sound stopped, then started again, getting farther and farther away. Only then did Caesar say we could move. I asked if he thought they were following us. He said he didn't know. But if they were, we had to find the Forbidden Valley before they did, or we wouldn't even have a chance to go home. We kept walking, but the mood had completely changed. It wasn't just an adventure anymore. Now it was pure tension. I walked looking ahead, but with my ears tuned to every noise behind me. Caesar walked silently, stepping lightly, holding the machete as if it were an extension of his arm. I tried not to step on twigs, but with every step, it felt like I made even more noise. Sometimes Caesar would stop suddenly, raising his hand for me to be quiet, and we'd just stand there listening to the sound of the forest. It was amazing how the silence of the woods could be so loud. After a while, we started seeing some strange structures. They looked like pieces of stone walls all covered in roots and moss. It looked ancient, like temple ruins. Caesar looked at it and said he had never seen anything like it. I asked if he thought it was the Forbidden Valley. He said maybe it was the entrance, and that if it was, we needed to be extra careful because a sacred place, even an abandoned one, doesn't forgive those who invade without respect. I started filming everything with my cell phone. I wanted to record every detail. Who knew if I would get out of there alive to tell the story? But at the same time, I was afraid of touching something and ending up triggering a trap or who knows what. Those stones had strange drawings on them. It looked like letters but also symbols. Some looked like serpents, others like crooked crosses. I asked Cesar if he knew how to read them. He said he didn't. That maybe it was a mix of indigenous symbols and symbols from Portuguese explorers. That gave me chills. Because Bento's journal talked about signs left for those who went after the valley. As I was recording, I heard a different noise, like something large being dragged across the ground. Cesar turned quickly, putting a finger to his lips for silence. We crouched behind a piece of a fallen wall. All I could hear was my heart beating so loud it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The noise continued, then faded until it disappeared. Cesar stayed still for a few minutes, just looking around. Then he pulled my arm and said, "Let's go. If it's people, we'd better not stick around to find out who they are." We walked a few more yards and entered a kind of natural tunnel, made by the roots of giant trees that intertwined above our heads. It was dark and damp. It smelled of wet earth mixed with mold. Caesar turned on his flashlight and pointed it forward. On the ground you could see marks like scratches, as if someone had dragged something heavy. I asked if he thought it was an animal. He shook his head and said it didn't look like animal tracks, and that if it was people, they were carrying something very large. After about 20 minutes inside that root tunnel, we came to a clearing, and there was the entrance to what looked like a cave. There were 2 stone columns on each side, a bit crooked, but still standing. On top of them was carved a symbol exactly like the one on the cover of Bento's journal, that cross mixed with a sun. When I saw that, my whole body shivered. It felt like the journal was guiding me to that exact place. Cesar stood still, just looking. He seemed mesmerized. He said, Henry, I think we found it. My legs felt weak. Everything I had read in the journal was right there in front of me. But at the same time, a huge fear hit me. I started to wonder if it wouldn't be better to turn back. Caesar asked me if I wanted to continue. I said yes, but that we needed to go slow. I hadn't come all this way to give up. We entered the cave slowly. The air inside was colder. The floor was covered with dry leaves and pieces of stone. Every step echoed, as if the mountain itself was listening to us. Caesar went ahead with the flashlight. I followed behind, recording everything, but my hand was shaking so much the video must have been all blurry. And that's when we started to see drawings on the walls. And the further we walked, the more certain I was that whatever was in there wasn't gold or precious stones. We kept walking inside the cave. The air in there smelled of damp stone and something a bit sour, hard to explain. Every time Caesar moved the flashlight, huge shadows formed on the walls, looking like monsters about to jump on us. The sound of our footsteps echoed, and I was sure anyone outside could hear. Sometimes I would stop just to try to listen if someone was coming behind us, but all you could hear was the dripping of water somewhere deep inside. After about 10 minutes of walking, the tunnel got narrower. We had to pass sideways in some sections. I scraped my shoulder on the cold stone walls. In one part, I felt something slimy. I looked back and saw it was a kind of greenish slime stuck to the wall. Caesar looked at me and said, "Don't touch the walls too much, Henry. It could be poisonous or at the very least give you a bad rash." Then I started to get even more tense. It felt like every inch of that place wanted to kick me out. We reached a larger chamber. It seemed to have been carved out of the rock, with a high ceiling. The floor was full of pieces of rotten wood as if there had been some structure there, like floors or platforms that had collapsed over time. On the back wall, there was something that looked like an altar, and right in the center a block of stone with carved marks. The symbol of the cross mixed with a sun appeared again, large, carved right in the middle of the block. Caesar stood still looking at it as if he were hypnotized. I couldn't take my eyes off it either. It felt like that stone was calling to me. I got closer and saw that there were letters engraved below the symbol. It was hard to understand. It looked like archaic Portuguese mixed with Latin, but I recognized a few words: plague, weapon, protect, and secret. I looked at Caesar and said, "This isn't a treasure at all. This is some secret they were trying to hide." Caesar shook his head slowly. He said he was starting to think that coming in here had been the biggest mistake of his life. While we were there, looking at that stone, we heard a noise coming from the tunnel we had entered through, a muffled sound like footsteps. I turned off my phone so there would be no light on. Caesar turned off his flashlight. We were in total darkness. I could feel my heart beating so hard it felt like it would give me away. The noise got closer, slow but firm steps. Caesar ducked behind a pile of rocks and pulled me with him. We stayed there, quiet, not even breathing. Suddenly a light appeared at the end of the tunnel. It was a flashlight, and someone started speaking in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded like Spanish, but it wasn't quite Spanish. The voice was hoarse, male. I saw a shadow enter the chamber where we were. The guy was holding the flashlight high, scanning every corner. I could see his silhouette, thin, tall, wearing a vest full of pockets. Caesar whispered in my ear, "They're after the valley." I have no doubt. The man stood looking around, as if he was sure someone was there. The beam of the flashlight passed so close to our faces I almost closed my eyes. The guy stopped for a few seconds listening. Then, he turned off his flashlight and walked slowly out of the tunnel. Only when the sound of his footsteps faded did Caesar breathe again. He looked at me and said, "Henry, we're not alone. And whatever they're looking for, they don't want witnesses." I asked if he thought they were criminals. Caesar said they could be traffickers, miners, mercenaries, or even government people trying to protect the secret. He said that sometimes the government hires people like that to make those who go where they shouldn't disappear. I froze. This whole thing was getting too big for my world of selling antiques. Caesar told me, "Henry, if what's written on this altar is true, it's not just us who are in danger, it's the whole world." I asked if he thought we should get out of there. Caesar replied that now that we had come so far, we either found out what was there or we would die not knowing. And I realized that even with the fear, I also wanted to know the truth. After that guy left, I stood there for a while, not sure what to do. Caesar pulled my arm and said we couldn't just stand there, that if they came back, they'd find us easily. But at the same time, I didn't want to leave without understanding what that altar, those symbols, those words were. I felt that if I left now, I would carry the weight of not having discovered what Bento tried so hard to hide for the rest of my life. Caesar was sweating, even in the damp cold of the cave. He told me, "Henry, either we take a quick look at what's here or we'll die not knowing. Your choice." I took a deep breath and said, "Let's look." Caesar lit up the altar again, and then I noticed that the bottom part, where the words were carved, seemed to have a compartment. There was a kind of crack, almost invisible, in the outline of the stone. I ran my hand over it and felt the stone move a little. I looked at Cesar and said, "Help me." He helped me push. The stone made a low click and opened a few inches. You could pull it. Caesar pulled slowly, and the stone slid forward, revealing a hollow space inside. I approached, holding the flashlight. Inside, there was a small, dark wood chest, its hardware covered in rust. The smell that came out of it was strong, a mix of mold and something chemical I couldn't identify. I carefully took the chest and placed it on top of the altar. Cesar looked at me tense and said, "Henry, if there's a curse, this is where it starts." I gave a nervous smile and said, "I don't believe in that stuff." But to be honest, my heart was beating so fast I couldn't even think straight. I carefully opened the chest's latch. The lid creaked as if it had never been opened. Inside there was no gold, no precious stones, nothing I expected to find. There were just a bunch of documents, all rolled up and tied with fabric ribbons. I took one roll of paper and carefully unrolled it. The pages were yellowed, but you could read them, and what was written there made me freeze. It talked about biological experiments conducted by the Portuguese over 200 years ago, studied diseases, formulas for dangerous substances, reports of the deaths of entire tribes, tests on indigenous populations. It was like a scientific journal mixed with secret reports. Bento, in his journal, said they had discovered something so deadly they decided to hide it forever. And now, I was reading it with my own eyes. Caesar was reading over my shoulder. His face changed with every line. He whispered, "Henry, this is a biological weapon. This is worth more than any treasure." I shook my head, unable to say anything, because at that moment I realized the scale of the trouble we were in. This wasn't just an adventure. It wasn't just a mystery. It was something that could kill thousands, maybe millions of people if it fell into the wrong hands. Caesar shook me and said, "We have to burn this, Henry. We can't leave here with this. If those men outside get these documents, it's over." I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to keep it, to show the world, to gain fame, maybe even money. But another, stronger part, said the right thing to do was to destroy it all. Bento was right to hide it. He tried to protect the world. And I was here almost bringing this disaster back. As we were arguing, we heard another noise from the tunnel. More footsteps, more voices. Only this time, it wasn't just one person. It was several, and they were coming fast. Caesar looked at me with desperation in his eyes and said, "Henry, decide now. Either you take it or you destroy it. Because if they get in here, the choice won't be yours anymore." I just stared at Caesar, frozen, holding those papers in my hand, feeling the weight of the entire world on my shoulders. He was there, almost shaking me, telling me to decide, but I couldn't. It was like my brain had crashed. All I could think was that this treasure was no treasure at all. It was poison. The voices were getting closer. Now I could make out some words. One of the men was saying, "Documents." Another was saying, "We can't let anyone leave." My blood ran cold. I realized there was no more time to think. I told Caesar, "Help me hide with these papers. If they find them, it's over." Caesar said hiding was useless, that if they found us, they'd torture us until we told them where it was. He then took the lighter from his pocket and lit it, holding it near the papers. The flame flickered, reflecting in his eyes. I shouted softly, "Are you crazy?" Caesar said, "Henry, either we destroy this now, or someone will use it to kill a lot of people. Think about what's written here." I looked at the pile of documents. There were chemical formulas, reports of horrible symptoms, names of decimated tribes. It was disgusting, and too dangerous to exist. Deep down, I knew he was right, but I also felt that destroying it would be like erasing the proof of the greatest secret in history. The voices were almost in the room. Caesar said, "It's now." I closed my eyes, took a deep breath and said, "Do it." Caesar touched the flame to the papers. The fire caught quickly. The old paper seemed to be soaked in oil or something. In seconds, it became an orange blaze. The smell was horrible, like burnt leather mixed with medicine. Caesar and I started throwing more papers into the flame. Everything burned fast. Letters written 200 years ago turned to ash before my eyes. I felt a lump in my throat. It was like destroying a piece of history, but I also knew that if someone got their hands on it, they could end the world. As we were burning everything, we heard the men enter the chamber. There were about 4 guys, all armed, flashlights in hand. Their leader, a tall, thin, bald man, pointed at us and shouted, "Freeze! Drop everything!" Caesar and I raised our hands, but we didn't stop pushing paper into the fire. The bald man ran toward us, kicked the altar, and tried to smother the flames with his jacket, but it was too late. The pages were turning to dust. He grabbed me by the shirt and yelled, "What was on those papers? Who sent you here?" I said, "Nobody sent us. We just found this. It was too dangerous." The guy shook me so hard I thought I was going to pass out. Caesar tried to intervene, but another man hit him with a rifle butt and knocked him to the ground. The bald man started shouting at me again. "You have no idea what you've just destroyed. That could have been worth billions." I replied, "It could have killed billions, and no one should have it." The bald man looked at me as if he was going to kill me right there. But before he could do anything, another man appeared at the entrance, speaking into a radio. He was saying there was movement outside the cave, that it could be the police or the army. The bald man cursed loudly, let go of my collar, and ordered the others to gather what was left. He looked at me and said, "You two were never here. If you tell anyone, I swear you'll disappear. Understand?" I nodded, trying to hide my fear. Caesar was still a bit dazed on the ground. The men ran out, leaving the chamber smelling of smoke and burnt paper. I stood there, breathing heavily, looking at the ashes scattered on the altar. It seemed like a movie scene, but it was real. Caesar got up slowly with a small cut on his forehead. He said, "Henry, if they had gotten those documents, it would have been the end. You did the right thing." I didn't say anything back. I just felt a mixture of relief and sadness, because while I felt saved, I also felt like I had just erased the biggest secret I had ever seen. But one thing I knew, if I had to choose again, I'd do it all the same. After those men left, Caesar and I stood there for a while, not sure what to do. The smell of burnt paper still filled the air, mixed with the cave's dampness. My head was throbbing, like I'd been hit. Caesar leaned against a rock, pressing a hand to his bleeding forehead, breathing deeply. No one spoke. The truth is, there was nothing left to say. Everything we had found, everything that could have changed the world, was now reduced to ashes on the altar. The only proof that any of it had ever existed was now in our memories, and maybe it was better that way. Caesar broke the silence first. He said, his voice hoarse, "Henry, we need to get out of here now. They might come back, or send others. And if the army's coming, I don't know if it's a good idea for us to stick around and explain what we were doing here." I just nodded. My legs felt like rubber. I could barely stand. But he was right. We had to get out of there. We quickly gathered the little equipment we had left. I erased my phone to leave no traces of video or photos, and we started walking back through the tunnel to the exit. The path seemed 1,000 times longer than it had on the way in. Every step echoed loudly. I was afraid more armed men would appear at any second. Caesar walked in front, limping a little, holding his machete as if it were the only thing giving him security. When we reached the part where the tunnel widened, we stopped to listen. The sound of the forest started to get louder again. Bird calls, animal cries, all mixed together. But I felt something different in the air. It felt like the place was heavier, as if the entire jungle knew what we had just done. Outside, the sun was already beginning to set. The light was turning reddish, filtering through the leaves. We came out of the cave slowly, looking around. There was no one waiting, but Caesar didn't relax. He said that if those men had let us go, it was because they might still be watching from a distance, or they would deal with the problem later, and that as long as we were here, we weren't safe. We started walking back into the jungle, trying to retrace our steps to the river. Caesar said it was better not to use the hidden snowmobiles because the noise could give us away, and also because there might be a bomb or a trap on them, in case those men had come back. I walked behind him, stumbling on roots, sweaty, my clothes soaked in mud. The backpack felt like it weighed a ton. With every noise in the woods, my heart raced. Sometimes I'd stop thinking I saw someone between the trees, but it was just a shadow, or maybe not. Caesar told me not to look back, just to keep walking, but I couldn't help it. It felt like at any moment Ven would appear, but of course I realized it wasn't Ven this time. It was a different kind of enemy. The wind brought the smell of wet earth, of rotting leaves, and with every step I took, the more I wondered if I had done the right thing by burning those papers. But then I remembered what was written on them, about diseases, about experiments on tribes, about the power to spread invisible death across the world. And I thought, no, there was no other choice. When we reached a stretch where the forest opened up a bit, Caesar stopped and pointed ahead. There was a clearing there, where the sun hit with force. In the middle of the clearing, you could see marks on the ground like a recent trail of many people passing through. Caesar got serious and said, "We can't go through there. If they're watching, that's where they'll get us." I asked what the plan was. He said we would go around, but that it would take more hours. I asked if it wasn't better to risk the direct path. Caesar looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "Henry, these guys won't think twice before shooting. Better to lose time than to lose your life." And I could only agree. So we turned left, pushing our way through the undergrowth, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest seemed to be closing in around us more and more. It felt like it was alive, and I wondered if I would ever get out of there, or if my body would become fertilizer for the Forbidden Valley. We kept pushing through the brush, skirting the clearing. Caesar was in front, clearing a path with his machete, cutting vines, pushing aside giant leaves. The sound of the machete hitting the vegetation mixed with my racing heart. I could feel my face sweating, my body trembling, not just from the physical effort, but because I was terrified. With every yard, I expected to see one of those armed men appear from between the trees. Caesar stopped suddenly, held up his hand, and listened. I stopped too, trying to hold my breath, but I was so winded I sounded like a wounded animal. The noise we heard came from deep in the woods. It was voices, more than one, speaking quickly, in a language I didn't quite understand. It sounded like Spanish mixed with something else. You couldn't tell what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, almost nervous. Caesar turned to me, whispering so quietly it was almost no sound at all. He said they were closer than we thought, and that if they caught us now, they wouldn't ask any questions. They would just solve the problem. I felt a pang in my stomach like I'd been punched. I was terrified, but at the same time, a part of me was getting angry. Angry at those men. Angry at Bento for getting me into this. Angry at the world, which always seemed to revolve around power and money no matter the price. Caesar pointed to a narrow path that went up an embankment. He said that if we could get to the top, we might see the river below, and if we saw the river, it meant we were close to where the boat had left us. I just nodded, not sure if it was courage or desperation that kept me walking. The climb was hell. The ground was slick with mud. The roots were slippery. Caesar climbed like an animal, digging his machete into the earth to pull himself up. I followed, slipping, banging my knee, dirty to my soul. Every time I thought about stopping, I remembered the bald man's face threatening me. I remembered the altar on fire, and I told myself I couldn't give up. When we got to the top, I almost collapsed. Caesar looked around, sweaty, breathing hard. Then he pointed ahead. In the distance, through the trees, you could see the reflection of water shining. The river. That shine looked like the most beautiful thing in the world. It was like seeing a way out, a chance, but the joy was short-lived. Caesar pulled my arm and told me to get down. Below us, on the riverbank, there were about 3 armed men, looking around as if they were waiting for someone. One of them had a radio in his hand. I realized they were patrolling the bank, probably looking for us. Caesar looked at me and said quietly, his voice hoarse with fear, "If we show ourselves down there now, they'll kill us before they ask any questions." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. My head was spinning. I tried to think of a plan, but nothing came. All I could feel was my body aching and a fear that left me almost paralyzed. Caesar said we had to wait for nightfall, that in the dark, we'd have a better chance of reaching the river without being seen. I looked at him and said, "But what if they don't leave? What if they bring more men?" Caesar answered with a tired face, "Then that's where we die, Henry. There's no other way." I felt a weight so heavy it felt like my chest would cave in. I looked at the sky, which was already starting to turn orange. Time was running out, and every minute that passed seemed to bring us closer to the end. We lay there, on the damp ground, waiting. The sound of the forest seemed to grow louder. Insects, birds, the wind rustling the leaves. Every sound made me jump. Caesar started telling me about his family, trying to distract himself. I barely heard him. My mind just kept going back to the image of the altar on fire, and to the cold eyes of those men. I wondered if I would get out of there alive, and if I did, how I would live knowing everything I had seen. We stayed there, hidden, until the sky was completely dark. Caesar kept peeking through the leaves to see if the men were still down below. but it was so dark you couldn't see anything anymore. You could only hear sometimes the snap of a twig, a radio crackling in the distance. I was trembling, not just from the cold, but from fear. I was sweaty, filthy, feeling every muscle in my body ache, and yet all I wanted was to get out of there alive. When the forest was completely dark, Caesar said it was time. He spoke in a calm tone, but I could tell he was as scared as I was. He said we would go down slowly without making a noise until we reached the river, and that if we saw anyone, we shouldn't run. We should stay still, as if we were part of the woods. I just nodded. I didn't have the energy to argue. The descent was even worse than the climb. Every rock I stepped on seemed to set off an avalanche of dirt. Caesar told me to stay low, almost crawling. At one point, I almost fell down the embankment. I managed to grab a branch, but the branch broke and I fell about 6 feet, hitting my shoulder on a rock. The pain was so intense I saw stars. Caesar pulled me up, cursing under his breath, telling me to get it together. When we got close to the bank, we lay in the mud, watching. We didn't see anyone. Caesar whispered that maybe the men had left, or maybe they were hidden, waiting for us to show ourselves. I didn't know which was worse. Caesar asked me if I could swim. I said yes, but I was exhausted. He said that even so, it was better to get in the water than to try to find the boat by walking along the riverbank. That in the water, at least, we had less chance of being seen. I got in the river without much thought. The water was freezing, it almost took my breath away. Caesar came in right behind me. We swam slowly, staying close to the bank, trying not to make waves. The sky was so dark it seemed to have disappeared. I felt things brushing past my leg the whole time. It could have been fish. It could have been a snake. I tried not to think. I just thought about getting out of there alive. We swam for a good few minutes until we reached a stretch where the bank was lower. We climbed out slowly, breathless, almost out of strength. We lay there in the mud, taking deep breaths. Caesar looked at me, his eyes wide, and said, "Henry, we survived." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I was so tired I could only lie there and look at the sky, trying to understand what had just happened to my life. After a while, Caesar said we needed to move, that if we stayed still, we'd die of cold or be found. We started walking through the woods until we reached a dirt road. We stayed there, hidden, until dawn. When the sun started to rise, an old truck passed by. Caesar waved and the driver stopped. He was an old man carrying sacks of flour. He didn't ask any questions, just told us to get in. I sat in the back, trembling, covered in mud from head to toe. As the truck bounced along the potholed road, I thought about everything that had happened. Bento's journal, the altar, the burned documents, the armed men, and I realized I would never be the same again. Caesar turned to me and said, "Henry, if anyone asks, we were just sightseeing. Don't mention anything about the Forbidden Valley." I just replied, "Okay," because I knew no one would believe me if I told the truth. We arrived in a small village after about 3 hours. Caesar dropped me off at a bus stop. I shook his hand firmly, thanked him, and told him he had saved my life. He smiled, but his eyes were empty. I knew he wouldn't forget this anytime soon either. I took a bus to Manaus. I spent the whole trip looking out the window trying to figure out where my life had gone. When I got to the hotel, I went into my room, locked the door, and just broke down. I cried like a child, not because of the fear, but because I knew I had destroyed the greatest discovery of my life. But I also knew that if I hadn't, I could have condemned the world. Today, every time I look at Bento's journal, which I kept with me, I remember the Forbidden Valley, and I know that no one will ever believe what I saw. And maybe it's better that way, because there are things that, if discovered, can end up destroying everything.
All right, it's that time. If this story has you hooked, let's do the full ritual. Hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss a beat, and ring that bell to be the first to know what's coming. Your opinion is golden, so drop it in the comments below.